There's a moment that happens in emergency rooms around the world, thousands of times each day. A heart monitor flatlines. Brain activity, which moments before was dancing across screens in complex patterns, begins to slow. The electrical signatures of consciousness appear to be fading. Medical teams move with practiced urgency. They call it clinical death. The body has stopped. The brain's rhythms have fallen silent. And yet, thousands of people who have been pulled back from this edge, who have been brought back from the threshold of whatever comes next, report something that should be impossible. While their brains were supposedly shutting down, while the electrical activity was ceasing, they were experiencing something vivid, something profound, something that many describe as more real than waking life. They speak of stepping outside their bodies and watching the medical team work on them from above, of moving through tunnels of light, of encountering beings of overwhelming presence and compassion, of receiving insights that restructured how they understood existence, of feeling peace so complete it made them reluctant to return to this world of pain and struggle. Neuroscience tells us this is impossible. A brain without blood, without oxygen, without electrical activity should produce nothing. No thoughts, no perceptions, no experiences, just darkness. Yet here are these testimonies, consistent, detailed, transformative, across cultures, across centuries, across belief systems. People who have touched something at the edge of death and come back changed forever. So what is actually happening at the boundary between consciousness and non-consciousness? Is the brain capable of experiences we've never theorized? Is consciousness something other than what our current models suggest? Or are we witnessing an elaborate trick of a dying brain? A final flourish of neural activity, creating the illusion of profound meaning. Tonight, we're going to explore one of humanity's deepest mysteries from every angle we can find. We'll move through neuroscience and philosophy, through medical paradox and lived experience, through the universal and the culturally specific. We'll follow the question not to a neat conclusion, but deeper into the mystery itself. Because sometimes the most important questions are the ones that refuse easy answers. Welcome to Sleepy Mind Lab. Though I have to warn you, some of what we'll explore tonight might be too fascinating to let you sleep right away. But that's okay. We have hours together. Some of this might challenge what you thought you knew about death, about consciousness, about the very nature of what it means to be aware. And that's precisely the point. If you find peace in these explorations, consider liking and subscribing. Creating these deep dives takes time, and your support helps me continue. Maybe leave a comment about near-death experiences or what you believe happens at the edge of consciousness, if you're still awake. I read every one. But no pressure. For now, just rest. Let your mind wander through these questions with me. The medical paradox, death, isn't what we thought. Before we can understand what people experience when they die, we need to ask a deceptively simple question. What actually is death? If that sounds straightforward, you're about to discover that it's anything but. Because the truth is, death is not a moment. It's not an event that happens all at once. Death is a process, a cascade, a territory with no clear borders. For most of human history, death was obvious. The heart stopped, breathing stopped. You were dead. Simple. Binary. Either alive or dead, nothing in between. But medicine began to complicate this certainty. Medicine learned to restart hearts, to restore breathing, to pull people back from what we once called the point of no return. In the 1950s, a cardiologist named Claude Beck successfully defibrillated a human heart for the first time. He shocked it back to life. The man lived. And suddenly, death became ambiguous. What had we saved him from? He had been dead. And then he wasn't. Something had changed. But what exactly? When exactly did death occur? When the heart stopped? When brain activity changed? When? The question became urgent in the 1960s when the first organ transplants became possible. You can't transplant organs from someone who's truly dead in the old sense, because the organs will die too. But you can transplant from someone whose brain has died while their body can be kept functioning. So countries began to redefine death. No longer was it the cessation of heartbeat or breathing. Death was now the permanent cessation of brain function. Brain death. A whole new category of death that wouldn't have even existed without machines to keep bodies alive. But even this definition creates strange categories. There's brain death, where the brain is permanently destroyed, but the body can live on machines. There's cardiac death, where the heart stops but the brain might still have a few minutes of activity. There's clinical death, where someone has technically died but can be resuscitated. There's biological death, which is more absolute. There's cellular death, which happens gradually over days as individual cells in the body run out of energy and begin to decompose. We have created this entire spectrum, and nowhere on this spectrum is there a bright line that says, here consciousness ends. It's a gradient, a fade, a territory of profound ambiguity. When someone experiences a near-death experience, it typically happens during clinical death. Their heart has stopped. Their blood pressure is 0. No oxygen is flowing to their brain. Medical teams are performing CPR, working to restart the heart. On paper, they are dead. In the room, machines are forcing the body to move, forcing oxygen into the lungs, but the brain itself is not breathing. It is not receiving fresh blood. It is beginning to die. And yet, in this moment, in this window that lasts seconds or minutes before irreversible damage sets in this territory where the brain is shutting down but not yet permanently destroyed, people report experiences of stunning clarity and vividness. The window is crucial. The brain can survive roughly 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen before permanent damage occurs, but not all damage is equal. The neocortex, the newer part of the brain associated with higher cognition, begins to suffer damage first. The brainstem, the older part that handles basic functions, can survive longer. So there's a window where parts of the brain are shutting down while others are still functioning. A window of profound neurological chaos where the normal rules don't seem to apply. What happens during this window is the question that animates everything that follows. Because if the brain is supposed to be dying, how does it produce any experience at all? How does a brain that's shutting down create experiences people describe as more vivid, more real, more meaningful than ordinary waking consciousness? Some researchers have proposed that these final moments might represent a kind of neurological death throes, the brain's last electrical storms as it ceases to function. Others suggest that the brain, facing extreme stress, might activate emergency systems we don't yet understand. Still others propose that something else entirely might be happening, something that challenges our fundamental assumptions about what consciousness is and where it lives. The medical paradox at the heart of all this is actually quite simple to state. We can measure brain death. We can watch a brain lose consciousness. We can observe the neurological changes that correspond to the dying process. And yet, in many cases, people who are going through this process report not unconsciousness, but heightened consciousness. Not the absence of experience, but the intensity of it. This is the beginning of the mystery. Not an answer, but the question that refuses to close. The phenomenology, what people actually report. Let's move away from the medical measurements for a moment and enter the territory of lived experience. Because to understand near-death experiences, we need to understand what they actually feel like from the inside. Not as a checklist of symptoms, but as an unfolding moment of consciousness encountering something utterly unfamiliar. People who have undergone near-death experiences often describe it as a moment of absolute transition. One moment they're aware of their body, aware of the medical emergency happening, perhaps aware of fear or pain. And then something shifts. Many describe it as a kind of threshold crossing. Some say there's a sense of movement, often described as going through a tunnel. Others describe a sudden shift in perspective, a sense of stepping sideways out of their body. Let's sit with the tunnel for a moment, because it's one of the most commonly reported features of near-death experiences, yet also one of the most puzzling. People describe moving through a tunnel, often with light at the end. They describe the walls as they pass through, sometimes feeling texture or seeing patterns. They describe a sense of movement, of acceleration, of traveling towards something. Now, a tunnel is a very specific shape. It's three-dimensional. It requires spatial reasoning to perceive. And yet, the brain of someone in cardiac arrest is not receiving oxygen. Its cells are dying. The structures necessary for spatial processing and visual perception should be offline. And yet people emerge from this experience with consistent, detailed descriptions of tunnel-like structures. One possibility is that the tunnel isn't perceived but generated. The brain, facing death, might create a tunnel as a cognitive framework for whatever is happening. The tunnel becomes a way of organizing experience, of putting it into familiar spatial categories. The brain says, something is happening, something is moving forward. I need a metaphor for this. And it generates a tunnel. But if that's true, it raises an interesting question. Why a tunnel specifically? Why do people across cultures and centuries, without exposure to the modern idea of the near-death tunnel, describe tunnel-like experiences? Why is this particular metaphor so universal? At the end of the tunnel, or sometimes without the tunnel at all, people describe light. An overwhelming light. Often they describe it as golden or white. Often they describe it as alive, as conscious, as aware of them. Not metaphorically. They're not saying it felt like love. They're saying the light itself seemed to be conscious, seemed to know them, seemed to emanate presence. The descriptions people give of this light are remarkable in their consistency and their strangeness. They describe it as impossible to describe. They say no earthly light is comparable. They say it was simultaneously brighter than anything they'd ever seen, and yet didn't hurt their eyes. They say it contained a kind of meaning, that to perceive the light was to somehow understand something profound, something communicative. Neuroscience has proposed explanations. Perhaps it's the release of DMT, a powerful hallucinogen produced by the brain, which can create overwhelming visual phenomena. Perhaps it's hypoxia affecting the visual cortex in particular ways. Perhaps it's the dying brain's attempt to interpret the sensations of shutdown in visual terms. But here's where the phenomenology becomes truly strange. Most hallucinogenic experiences, most visual phenomena produced by altered neurochemistry, have a dreamlike quality. They're surreal, disjointed. They follow dream logic, where one thing transforms into another, where space and time behave strangely. Near-death experiences, by contrast, are often described as more coherent than waking experience. People describe perfect clarity, perfect awareness, perfect memory of every detail. Not dreamlike, hyperreal. Beyond the light, people describe encounters, beings, entities. Sometimes these are identified as loved ones who have died. Sometimes they're described as guides or angelic presences. Sometimes they're unidentifiable but felt to be deeply significant. These beings, people report, communicate not in words, but in something like direct knowledge transfer. They understand what the being is saying not through language, but through a kind of direct mind-to-mind communication. The encounters often carry overwhelming emotional weight. People describe being met with love so complete, so unconditional, so absolute, that it restructures their understanding of what love is. They describe being known completely, all their failings and shame fully visible, and being loved anyway. Loved completely, loved infinitely. This emotional component is perhaps the most transformative aspect of near-death experiences. Not the light, not the tunnel, not the beings, but the experience of being loved in this overwhelming, unconditional way. People describe it as the most important experience of their lives. They describe it as changing their fundamental sense of what's possible for human consciousness to feel. And here's the phenomenological puzzle. If this is a hallucination produced by a dying brain, why would it be overwhelmingly positive? Why would a brain in crisis produce experiences of unconditional love rather than fear? Why would the most common emotional tone be peace rather than panic? This is where mechanism and meaning begin to diverge. We might eventually understand the neurochemistry that produces these experiences. We might identify which brain systems are involved. But the question of why the brain would produce love rather than fear remains puzzling. Evolution would suggest that a brain facing death might produce fear, creating a final surge of adrenaline, preparing for fight or flight. And yet many near-death experiences are marked by a profound sense of peace that overrides all fear. Some people describe additional phenomena. Time becomes strange. They experience what seems like hours of experience in seconds of clock time. Or alternately, seconds expand to feel like hours. They describe perfect memory access, able to recall events from childhood with crystal clarity. They describe knowledge of things they shouldn't know, information that proves accurate upon investigation. Some people describe a life review, where they experience their entire life from a perspective of profound understanding. They see moments of kindness they'd forgotten. They feel the impact of cruelty they'd inflicted, not as punishment, but as understanding. They experience their life from a viewpoint of complete perspective, as though their individual consciousness had momentarily merged with some larger consciousness that could see the whole tapestry. These are the phenomena. These are what people report. The consistency of these reports across cultures and centuries is striking. The vividness and coherence of the experiences is puzzling. And the transformation that follows is undeniable. People come back from near-death experiences permanently changed. Not just in their beliefs, but in their values, their priorities, their sense of what matters. The cross-cultural tapestry. What humans everywhere seem to touch. One of the most intriguing aspects of near-death experiences is how similar they are across cultures and belief systems that have had no contact with each other. A person from Japan describes nearly identical features to a person from medieval Europe, describes nearly identical features to a person from contemporary America. The light, the beings, the sense of movement, the unconditional love, the reluctance to return. The core elements repeat. Yet culture shapes everything. Culture shapes what we see, what we believe, how we interpret our experiences. So the question becomes, are near-death experiences universal? Or are people across cultures having similar neurological events that they then interpret through their cultural framework? This is a genuinely difficult question to answer, because you can't separate the experience from the interpretation. The moment someone begins to describe an experience, they're already interpreting it. They're already putting it into cultural categories. The light becomes the light of God, or the light of enlightenment, or the light of consciousness, depending on their cultural framework. The beings become angels or guides or ancestors or bodhisattvas, depending on their beliefs. Yet there are intriguing patterns. Christian near-death experiences often don't feature Jesus, despite Christianity being centered on Christ. They feature light and beings and love, but usually not a figure identified as Jesus. Islamic near-death experiences often feature an Islamic landscape, but not Allah directly. Buddhist near-death experiences often feature a light, but not Buddha himself. The most transcendent aspects of religion seem to emerge in near-death experiences, while the culturally specific aspects seem to be less central. There's a phenomenon in near-death research where people describe encountering beings of light, and these beings are often interpreted as angels or guides or spiritual beings of some kind. But here's what's interesting. These beings often don't match the cultural expectations exactly. An evangelical Christian might expect angels as described in the Bible, but instead encounters something that feels more universal, more beyond doctrine. A Hindu might expect to encounter Krishna or another deity, but instead encounters something that doesn't fit the traditional categories. Some researchers propose that this is evidence for something real and universal being touched. That across cultures, humans encountering the boundary of consciousness touch something authentic, something beyond cultural construct. That the cultural interpretations come after, that people fit their experience into their existing frameworks, but the core experience is pointing to something universal. Others propose that this reflects the universality of human neurology, that all brains, across all cultures, respond to extreme stress and oxygen deprivation in similar ways. That the light, the tunnel, the beings are all products of a brain in crisis, and they're similar across cultures because human brains are similar. The cultural interpretation comes after the neurological event, not the other way around. But here's where it gets more complex. Historical near-death experiences from centuries ago, from cultures that had no concept of tunnels or the modern NDE imagery, sometimes describe different phenomena. Medieval accounts of near-death sometimes describe journeys through otherworldly landscapes that don't match modern descriptions. They describe different categories of beings, different challenges and tests. Yet some core elements persist. This suggests that perhaps what's universal is not the specific imagery, but something more basic. Perhaps what's universal is the sense of transition, the encounter with something beyond the individual self, the experience of a vastly expanded perspective, the contact with unconditional love or profound truth. The specific forms these take might be shaped by culture and expectation, but the underlying phenomena might have a universal core. Consider the question differently. What if the brain's near-death experience is like a musical instrument that's universal, but culture provides the score? The instrument is the same across all humans, but what music plays depends on the cultural programming. So someone from a Christian culture will interpret the light in Christian terms. Someone from a secular culture might interpret it as consciousness itself or the fabric of reality. Someone from a Buddhist culture might interpret it as nirvana or enlightenment. But they're all playing the same instrument. There's also the question of selection bias. The near-death experiences that get reported, that get studied, that get written about, are not a random sample of all near-death experiences. They're disproportionately positive. They're disproportionately the ones that transformed people's lives. There might be near-death experiences that are mundane, that are forgettable, that don't change anyone's perspective. But these don't get reported. So the cross-cultural consistency we see might be partly an artifact of what gets studied. Yet even accounting for this, the consistency is striking. We have accounts from ancient Greece. We have accounts from medieval Christianity. We have accounts from Islamic mysticism. We have accounts from indigenous cultures. We have accounts from contemporary secular people. And across these diverse contexts, certain patterns emerge repeatedly. The question of cross-cultural consistency is ultimately asking, is there something universal about what consciousness encounters at its boundary? Or is there something universal about how human brains respond to extreme conditions, combined with universal human patterns of meaning-making? Or is it both? The answer might be that this question itself points to something important. That the very fact that we can't clearly separate universal human neurology from universal human spirituality might tell us something. That the boundary between neurology and spirituality, between mechanism and meaning might be less clear than we typically assume. The neuroscience of the dying brain, what we know and what we don't. Let's move into the territory of neuroscience and try to understand what actually happens in the brain during near death. Not to explain away the experience, but to understand the neurological conditions under which it occurs. Because whatever is happening at the boundary of consciousness, it's happening in a brain. It's happening in a specific neurological state. Understanding that state might illuminate something important. When a heart stops, when blood flow to the brain ceases, a cascade of neurological events begins. Within seconds, the brain runs out of oxygen. Neurons begin to fail. But they don't all fail at once. There's a sequence. The process is more like a dying fire than a switch turning off. First, the brain uses up its stores of energy. ATP, the molecule that powers neural activity, begins to deplete. Without sufficient energy, neurons can't maintain their normal electrochemical gradients. The barriers that normally keep sodium outside cells and potassium inside begin to fail. Sodium floods in, potassium leaks out. The electrical balance that allows neurons to fire begins to collapse. As this happens, there's a surge of neural activity. The dying brain fires intensely. Researchers have observed, in animal models, something called a terminal depolarization, a massive wave of neural activity that sweeps through the brain as it loses the ability to maintain normal function. It's as if the brain, facing death, engages in one final burst of activity. This terminal depolarization might be crucial to understanding near-death experiences. Because in this moment of intense neural activity, in this state where normal inhibitory mechanisms are failing and normal patterns of communication are breaking down, something unusual might be happening. The brain might be operating under conditions it never experiences in normal consciousness. The normal boundaries between brain regions might be breaking down. The normal inhibitory signals that usually keep different regions from interfering with each other might be failing. What would happen if the visual cortex, the region responsible for sight, suddenly became extremely active at the same moment that normal sensory input was being cut off? What would happen if this heightened activity in the visual regions was not being suppressed by the normal regulatory signals? You might get visual phenomena, bright light, vivid imagery, imagery that felt intensely real because it was being generated by visual processing regions that were unusually active. This is one possible explanation for the light reported in near-death experiences. Not perception of an external light, but the brain's visual system engaging in a kind of seizure activity, generating light like sensations in the absence of external visual input. Similarly, the sense of moving through a tunnel might reflect the spatial processing systems of the brain engaging in unusual activity. The brain's representation of space, normally constrained by external sensory input, might be generating its own spatial narratives when that external constraint is removed. This is where the endogenous DMT theory enters. DMT is dimethyltryptamine, a powerful hallucinogen that appears to be produced by the human body, possibly in the pineal gland. DMT is known to produce intense visual phenomena, a sense of encountering entities, profound emotional experiences. Some researchers have proposed that in the moment of death, the brain might release DMT, which would then bind to neural receptors and produce the near-death experience. The appeal of this theory is that it could explain multiple aspects of near-death experiences. The intense visuals, the sense of encountering beings, the overwhelming emotional tone, the sense of profound meaning. DMT is known to produce all of these things, but there are complications. First, the existence of DMT in the human brain is not definitively proven. We know it exists in other animals and can be synthesized in labs, but whether the human pineal gland produces it remains controversial. Second, even if the brain does produce DMT, it's not clear why it would do so in response to oxygen deprivation. Third, and perhaps most interestingly, DMT experiences, while intense, often have a surreal dreamlike quality. They have the logic of dreams, where one thing transforms into another, where space and time behave strangely. Near-death experiences, by contrast, are often described as having a hyperreal clarity and coherence that doesn't match typical hallucinogenic experiences. There's also the question of timing. How long would DMT be circulating in the brain before it began to affect consciousness? There's a window of only minutes during which the brain remains oxygenated enough to potentially have experiences. If near-death experiences require the production and circulation and binding of DMT, this all has to happen within that narrow window. The default mode network is another crucial piece of the puzzle. This is a network of brain regions that becomes active when we're not focused on the external world, when we're thinking about ourselves, our past, our future, our place in the world. It includes regions like the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. When we're focused on tasks, the default mode network quiets down. When we're resting or daydreaming, it becomes active. In normal consciousness, the default mode network creates the sense of self. It's the network that generates the feeling that you are a unified individual with a continuous identity over time. It's what generates self-awareness. Now, here's what's interesting. In some altered states of consciousness, like meditation or psychedelic use, people report a dissolution of the sense of self. A kind of ego death where the normal sense of individuality dissolves. And this dissolution correlates with decreased activity in the default mode network. In near-death experiences, people often report something similar. They report a sense of the boundaries of the self dissolving. They report a sense of merging with something larger. They report experiencing reality from a perspective that's not limited to their individual viewpoint. If during the dying process, the default mode network is shutting down, this could explain the dissolution of the individual self and the sense of merging with something larger. The brain's construction of individual identity is ceasing, and in its place, some other form of consciousness might be emerging. Not the normal sense of being a separate self, but something broader, something less bounded. But what would that broader consciousness be? Is it consciousness itself, stripped of the individual perspective? Is it a remnant of the dying brain creating a final coherent narrative? Is it something else entirely? Here's where we reach the limit of current neuroscience. We can identify the brain regions involved. We can describe the neurochemical cascades. We can propose mechanisms. But we can't yet explain why a brain in crisis would produce experiences described as more real and more meaningful than normal consciousness. We can't explain why, instead of fear, there's often overwhelming peace. We can't explain the reports of accurate knowledge or information that the person couldn't have known through normal sensory channels. These are the explanatory gaps. Not failures of neuroscience, but the boundaries where current neuroscience reaches its limits. The place where the questions become philosophical rather than purely biological. The hard problem of consciousness, where neurology and philosophy collide. We've been exploring near-death experiences from the perspective of neuroscience and phenomenology. Now we need to address something deeper. Something that near-death experiences throw into sharp relief. The hard problem of consciousness itself. This is perhaps the deepest mystery in science and philosophy, and near-death experiences are a window into this mystery. The hard problem of consciousness is simple to state but impossible to solve. Why does physical brain activity feel like something? Consider a visual system. A brain region called the visual cortex receives signals from the eyes. It processes this information. It creates representations of color, shape, movement. We can study all of this. We can measure it. We can understand the mechanisms completely. But none of this explains why the experience of seeing red feels the way it does. Why it has this particular subjective quality. Why it's like something to see red, rather than just processing the information unconsciously. This is the hard problem. The easy problem is explaining the mechanisms. The hard problem is explaining the subjective experience, the what it's likeness of consciousness. Now, most neuroscientists tend to assume that the hard problem will eventually be solved by better neuroscience. They assume that as we understand the brain better, we'll understand consciousness better. We'll close the gap between the objective fact of brain activity and the subjective fact of experience. But near-death experiences complicate this assumption, because in near-death experiences, we have cases where the normal correlations between brain activity and consciousness seem to break down. Normally, as brain activity decreases, consciousness decreases. A person in a deep sleep has less brain activity and less consciousness than someone who's awake. A person in a coma has even less brain activity and no consciousness. And yet in many near-death experiences, people report heightened consciousness, vivid experience, perfect clarity, at a moment when brain activity is supposed to be shutting down. Some researchers have proposed theories to account for this. One is called Integrated Information Theory, or EIT. This theory proposes that consciousness is a property of systems that integrate information in particular ways. The more integrated the information, the higher the consciousness. Interestingly, IIT predicts that as the brain is dying, in that moment where normal organization is breaking down but hasn't yet ceased entirely, there might be a surge in integrated information. The normal barriers between brain regions are failing, allowing information to flow in unusual ways. From the perspective of IIT, this surge in integration might correspond to a surge in consciousness. This is speculative, but it's interesting because it suggests that consciousness might not be a simple function of total brain activity. Consciousness might be a function of how information is organized and integrated. And the dying brain, for a brief moment, might achieve unusual levels of integration even as its total activity is decreasing. Other theories point to the possibility that consciousness is not purely a product of the brain's activity. Some philosophers and physicists have speculated about whether consciousness might be more fundamental than we typically assume. The physicist Roger Penrose has proposed that consciousness might arise from quantum processes in the brain, processes that might not follow the normal rules of neural activity as we currently understand them. These are wild ideas. They're controversial. Many neuroscientists dismiss them as unfounded speculation. And perhaps they are, but they arise in response to a real problem. The hard problem of consciousness is genuinely hard. We don't have good explanations yet for why brain activity feels like something. There's also the philosophical question of dualism. For centuries, philosophers have grappled with the question of whether consciousness is purely physical or whether it might be something separate that interacts with the physical brain. Cartesian dualism, the view proposed by Descartes that consciousness is a non-physical substance interacting with the physical brain, fell out of favor as neuroscience developed. We found brain correlates for everything. We found that damage to the brain affects consciousness. We found that chemicals can alter consciousness. All of this suggested that consciousness is purely a product of brain activity. But near-death experiences raise the question again. If consciousness is purely a product of brain activity, how do people have vivid experiences when brain activity is shutting down? Maybe consciousness is not purely physical. Maybe it's interacting with the brain, but not entirely dependent on it. This is where the philosopher David Chalmers comes in. Chalmers famously divided the problem of consciousness into the easy problems and the hard problem. The easy problems are explaining the functions of consciousness. the things consciousness does. The hard problem is explaining subjective experience itself. Chalmers has been open to the possibility that the hard problem might require new approaches. New physics, perhaps. New conceptions of consciousness. He's been respectful toward near-death experiences as data that might be relevant to understanding consciousness. Here's what's crucial to understand. We might eventually explain all the neurological mechanisms involved in near-death experiences. We might identify exactly which brain regions are active, which neurotransmitters are involved, which neural pathways are being activated. We might create a complete mechanistic explanation of near-death experiences. And even if we do all that, we still won't have solved the hard problem. We still won't have explained why any of this feels like something. Why the person experiences the light as beautiful. Why they experience the love as real. Why the experience of being aware feels like anything at all. The hard problem suggests that there's something about consciousness that mechanism alone might not capture. That understanding how something works is different from understanding what it is to be that thing. That there might be a perspective from inside experience that can't be fully captured by an external, objective description. This doesn't mean consciousness is non-physical or immaterial. It doesn't mean dualism is true. It just means that understanding consciousness might require methods and concepts beyond those of traditional neuroscience. It might require first-person accounts like those from near-death experiences. It might require philosophy. It might require phenomenology, the careful study of subjective experience. Near-death experiences are inviting us to think about consciousness differently. Not as something to be explained away, but as something to be taken seriously, studied carefully, and understood in its own terms, in its own categories. Heightened cognition in the dying state, the puzzle that refuses to fit. One of the most puzzling aspects of near-death experiences is something we keep circling back to, but haven't quite addressed head-on. In near-death experiences, people report not diminished consciousness, but heightened consciousness. Not confusion, but clarity. Not degradation of cognition, but enhancement of it. People report perfect memory. They remember events from childhood with crystal clarity. They access memories they thought were forgotten. They perceive with what they describe as hyperreal vividness. Everything feels more clear, more sharp, more real than normal waking consciousness. This is the puzzle that doesn't fit the standard neuroscience narrative. Because everything we know about brain damage and oxygen deprivation suggests that these conditions should impair cognition, not enhance it. A brain being starved of oxygen should be functioning worse, not better. Its perceptual and cognitive abilities should be degrading, not sharpening. And yet here are thousands of accounts of the opposite. People pulled back from the brink of death, reporting that in that moment, when their brain was supposedly shutting down, they were thinking more clearly than they ever had. Let's think about what this means. Normally, our consciousness is filtered. We're aware of only a fraction of what our brain processes. There's tremendous cognitive activity happening below the threshold of consciousness. Our brain is constantly filtering information, deciding what to attend to and what to ignore. This filtering is adaptive. It allows us to focus. It allows us to function in a complex world by not overwhelming ourselves with information. But what if this filtering could be temporarily removed? What if, in the moment of death, as the normal regulatory systems of the brain begin to fail, the filters begin to come off? The brain's inhibitory systems, the systems that normally suppress neural activity and maintain focused awareness, might begin to fail. When they do, what was previously filtered below the threshold of consciousness might suddenly become available to awareness. This could explain the sense of perfect memory. Not that the brain is remembering things better, but that it's giving access to memories that are always being recorded, but normally filtered from consciousness. It's like removing the password protection from a hard drive. The information was always there. You just weren't able to access it under normal circumstances. This could explain the sense of hyperreal clarity. Not that perception is sharper, but that more of what the brain perceives is reaching consciousness. The brain is normally bombarding us with sensory data. Most of it never reaches conscious awareness. We're aware of the small portion our attention is focused on. But what if suddenly, instead of being aware of only a fraction of what your brain perceives, you became aware of much more? The experience might be overwhelming. Overwhelming not because the brain is impaired, but because the filters are off. But this explanation has its own problems. If the filters are off, if the inhibitory systems are failing, we'd expect the experience to be chaotic. We'd expect it to be overwhelming in a distressing way. We'd expect the person to be confused by too much input, not calm and peaceful. And yet many near-death experiences are marked by profound peace and order, not chaos. Furthermore, this explanation doesn't address the reports of knowledge that the person shouldn't have. People in near-death experiences sometimes report accurate information about events they couldn't have known through normal sensory channels. They report accurate descriptions of what medical staff are doing while they're supposedly unconscious and their brain activity is minimal. There have been careful studies of this. Researchers have placed hidden words or images on shelves in ICU rooms where near-death experiences commonly occur. If people are accurate in their descriptions of what's happening in the room, they should be able to read these hidden words. Some researchers claim they have found cases where this happens. Though the results are controversial and other researchers are skeptical. If these reports of accurate knowledge are genuine, they challenge the idea that near-death experiences are purely hallucinations generated by a dying brain. Hallucinations don't typically contain accurate information about external events the hallucinatory subject isn't perceiving. There's also the question of accelerated thought. People report experiencing what seems like hours of experience in seconds of clock time. They describe extremely complex experiences, detailed encounters, intricate visions, all happening in a very brief window. How is it possible for a brain to generate such complex experience in such a short time? One possibility is that the dying brain, freed from some of its normal constraints, can process information much faster. Like a computer freed from background programs suddenly running faster. But this seems to push against what we know about the brain's processing speed. The brain's processing is constrained by fundamental neurological limits. Speeding it up would be like trying to run a computer program faster than its processor allows. Another possibility is that the experience of time itself is being altered. That the dying brain's perception of duration is changing. So what feels like hours is actually only seconds. But then we face the question of why a dying brain would experience time in this particular altered way. There's also the question of the profound insights people report receiving during near-death experiences. People describe encountering truths about the nature of reality, the meaning of existence, the fundamental nature of consciousness and love. They describe these insights as being given to them, being revealed to them, being understood directly without language or reasoning. If these insights are being generated by the brain, the question is how. How does a brain being starved of oxygen suddenly generate philosophical and spiritual insights that restructure people's understanding of reality? How does a dying brain become a source of wisdom? Unless, of course, these insights are not being generated by the brain at all. Unless the brain is perceiving something. Unless consciousness, in this dying state, is encountering something that exists beyond the individual mind. Something universal? something that's always there, but normally filtered out or hidden from access. This is where we enter speculative territory. Territory where neuroscience and spirituality begin to look at the same phenomena from different frameworks, and the frameworks become less useful. The puzzle of heightened cognition in the dying state might require expanding our understanding of what cognition is. Normally, we think of cognition as the brain's processing of information. But what if cognition is broader than that? What if consciousness can directly perceive reality in ways that don't require neural processing? What if there are forms of knowing that don't fit into our current categories? These are the questions that force us to think beyond the boundaries of what science can currently address. Not because science is wrong, but because these questions might require new conceptual frameworks, new ways of thinking, new categories. The transformation, how near-death experiences rewire lives. Let's step back from the mystery of consciousness itself and look at something more concrete. What happens after? What transformation occurs in people who have had near-death experiences? Because regardless of what's happening during the near-death experience, what happens afterward is undeniable. Near-death experiences change people. Permanently. Profoundly. The changes are not subtle. Researchers studying near-death experiences have documented consistent patterns of transformation. People who have had near-death experiences consistently report a decrease in fear of death. This is measurable. This is persistent. Even years after the experience, people who've had near-death experiences report less anxiety about death than the general population. This makes sense if you think about it. If someone has encountered what might be the ultimate threshold, has touched what might be the afterlife, and has found it to be peaceful or beautiful or filled with love, why would they fear returning to it? The fear of death is often fear of the unknown. But someone who's glimpsed what might lie beyond has had that particular fear partially addressed. But the transformation goes far beyond fear of death. Values shift. Priorities realign. People who have had near-death experiences often report that things that once mattered greatly suddenly matter very little. Career ambitions fade. Material concerns diminish. Status and achievement, which drove them before, suddenly seem less important. What becomes more important? Connection, love, compassion, meaning, service. People who have had near-death experiences often feel called to live in alignment with what they experienced. The unconditional love they encountered becomes a new standard for how they want to live. The sense of interconnection they felt becomes a motivation for treating others with greater kindness. Some researchers have studied these changes using personality assessments and psychological measures. They find that people who've had near-death experiences score differently on measures of psychological well-being even years after the experience. They show greater life satisfaction, greater sense of meaning, greater compassion and empathy. There are cases where the transformation is dramatic. People who were self-centered become service-oriented. People who were materialistic become spiritually focused. People who were anxious and depressed report lasting improvements in mood. It's as if the near-death experience provides a fundamental reset, a recalibration, a new understanding of what matters. And here's what's interesting. These transformations persist. They're not temporary changes that fade over time. Studies of people who've had near-death experiences years or decades earlier find that the transformation has lasted. The shift in values has persisted. The decrease in fear of death has persisted. The increase in compassion has persisted. This raises an interesting question. If near-death experiences are purely hallucinations, purely products of a dying brain, why would they produce such lasting psychological changes? Hallucinations, even intense ones, even ones produced by drugs, typically don't produce such persistent transformation in values and personality. Think about hallucinogenic drug experiences. They can be profound. They can feel deeply meaningful in the moment. But often, once the drug wears off and normal consciousness returns, the significance fades. The person might retain intellectual memories of insights they had, but the emotional impact, the felt sense of importance, often diminishes. But near-death experiences are different. The impact is often as strong years later as it is immediately after. People describe the sense that they've encountered something utterly real and significant, something that cannot be unseen. One way to think about this is through the lens of memory and meaning. When something feels supremely important and real at the moment of experience, the brain encodes it with high emotional salience. It becomes a central memory. It becomes a reference point for future experience. Every time you encounter something that relates to what you learned in the near-death experience, it activates that memory and reinforces its significance. So a person who experienced overwhelming love in a near-death experience might find that encountering love in daily life, or encountering someone in need of love, or encountering a moment of connection with another person, triggers that memory. The neural pathways associated with the near-death experience light up. The emotional significance is reactivated. This reinforces the transformation. But there's another possibility. What if the transformation is genuine not because the experience feels real, but because it is real? What if the near-death experience is not a hallucination, but a genuine encounter with something actual? What if consciousness, in the dying state, actually does access something real, something universal, something true? If that's the case, then the transformation would be genuine transformation into a deeper understanding of reality. The person would be changed because they've actually seen something true. Their values would shift because they've encountered something genuinely valuable. Their compassion would increase because they've directly experienced the fundamental interconnection of consciousness. This is not something we can currently prove or disprove scientifically, but it's a framework worth considering. Because if near-death experiences do grant access to something real, then the transformation they produce is not an illusion. It's a response to genuine truth, an alignment with how reality actually is. We might ask, does it matter whether the near-death experience is really real, or a very convincing hallucination, if it produces such profound positive transformation? If it decreases suffering, increases compassion, increases sense of meaning and purpose, increases connection to others, what difference does the ultimate metaphysical status of the experience make? This is a genuinely interesting philosophical question, because one answer is that it doesn't matter. If the result is healing and transformation, that's what matters. The mechanism is less important than the effect. But another answer is that truth matters. That if we're believing something false, even if it makes us feel better, we're still believing something false. That integrity requires caring about what's actually real, not just what makes us feel better. A third answer, though, is that maybe this false dichotomy between really real and helpful is not the right way to think about it. Maybe the transformation is real because consciousness itself is real. Maybe when people's consciousness is touched by something profound, something fundamentally shifts. Maybe the fact that this shift persists and deepens the person's understanding of reality suggests that they've encountered something authentic, that their consciousness has touched something beyond the ordinary, the explanatory gap, where science reaches its limit. We've explored near-death experiences from neuroscience, from phenomenology, from philosophy, from the study of transformation. Now let's address the central problem directly. The problem that keeps rising throughout this exploration. The gap between what we can explain and what remains mysterious. The central problem is this: we cannot reproduce genuine near-death experiences in laboratories. We've tried. Researchers have attempted to create conditions, similar to near-death experiences using various methods. Virtual reality has been used to simulate the tunnel and the light. Meditation has been proposed as a way to access altered states similar to near-death experiences. Psychedelic substances have been studied because they produce profound alterations of consciousness. Some of these approaches do produce experiences that resemble near-death experiences in certain ways. But they don't produce the full phenomenon. They don't produce the same quality of hyperreal clarity. They don't produce the same sense of absolute conviction that something real is being encountered. They don't produce the same lasting transformation. In particular, psychedelic experiences, while sometimes beautiful and meaningful, often have a dreamlike quality. The surrealism that's characteristic of dreams is often present. Things transform into other things. Space and time behave strangely. By contrast, near-death experiences, while they involve strange phenomena, typically have a hyperreal coherence. They have the clarity of waking consciousness, not the fluidity of dreams. This has led to a methodological impasse. We cannot study near-death experiences in the controlled conditions of laboratory science. We cannot produce them reliably. We cannot manipulate variables. We cannot replicate them. We can only study them by collecting retrospective reports from people who've had them, studying their accounts, looking for patterns. This is not ideal from a scientific perspective. Retrospective accounts are subject to memory distortion. They're subject to post hoc interpretation. They're subject to cultural influences on how people interpret and remember their experiences. The longer the time between the near-death experience and the account, the more likely the account is to be influenced by subsequent experiences and beliefs. But the alternative, conducting controlled studies of actual near-death experiences, is ethically impossible and practically infeasible. You can't deliberately bring people to the brink of death to study their experiences. So we're in a situation where perhaps the most profound and interesting phenomenon related to consciousness cannot be studied using the methods of controlled experimental science. We can study the brain correlates. We can study retrospective accounts. We can study the changes that result. But we cannot directly study the thing itself, under controlled conditions, in the way we study most scientific phenomena. This creates a kind of explanatory plateau. We can build theories. We can propose mechanisms. We can make educated guesses about what's happening. But we can't test those theories the way we'd normally test scientific theories. We can't do controlled experiments. We can't verify predictions through direct observation of the phenomenon. There's also the problem of what we might call theory selection. Multiple theories can fit the available data. A neurological theory that attributes near-death experiences to brain activity patterns can explain most of the reports. A consciousness is fundamental theory that proposes that near-death experiences are genuine encounters with non-ordinary reality can also explain the reports. A theory that attributes near-death experiences to false memories and cultural construction can explain much of the data too. Each theory can point to aspects of the data that support it. Each can find ways to explain away data that seem to contradict it. But there's no clear, decisive experiment that would definitively rule out one theory and support another. This is partly because near-death experiences are rare and hard to study. But it's also partly because we're bumping up against the limits of reductionist science. We're trying to explain first-person subjective experience using only third-person objective methods. And there might be a fundamental limitation there. Consider the hard problem of consciousness again. Even with a complete understanding of all the brain correlates of consciousness, even if we could map every neural connection and every neurotransmitter interaction, we still wouldn't have explained subjective experience itself. We'd have explained the mechanisms, but not the experience. Near-death experiences raise this problem acutely, because they're cases where subjective experience seems to be particularly important, where the first-person account is particularly reliable and significant, where what it feels like seems to matter more than the objective facts. A third party observing a near-death experience from outside would see someone who's clinically dead or near dead, whose brain activity is minimal, whose body is being worked on by medical personnel, who is unable to communicate about their experience in the moment. But from the first-person perspective of the person undergoing the experience, something utterly different is happening. Something vivid and profound and real. The gap between these two perspectives is not something neuroscience can fully bridge. Not because neuroscience is wrong, but because these are different kinds of facts. Third-person facts about brain activity and first-person facts about subjective experience are different categories. Understanding one doesn't automatically give you understanding of the other. Furthermore, there are genuine puzzles about the relationship between brain activity and near-death experiences. If near-death experiences require a functioning brain, even a minimally functioning brain, then we'd expect them to be most likely when brain activity is highest, not when it's lowest. And yet they seem to occur when brain activity is minimized. This is backwards from what we'd expect if consciousness is simply an emergent property of brain activity. Some researchers have proposed that near-death experiences occur during the recovery of consciousness, not during the depths of unconsciousness. That they occur as the brain is being resuscitated, when certain regions are coming back online. This would explain why they seem to involve heightened consciousness at a moment when overall brain activity is low. Some regions would be beginning to recover and become active again. But this is speculative. It's a hypothesis that fits some of the data, but doesn't address all of it. And there are accounts of people having clear near-death experiences at moments when their brain activity remains severely depressed throughout. So we're left with a genuine explanatory gap. The phenomena of near-death experiences, the reports, the transformations, the patterns across cultures, the heightened cognition, the accurate perceptions. All of this presents a puzzle that current science cannot fully explain. Not because science is deficient, but because the phenomenon seems to exceed the scope of what reductionist physical science can address. This doesn't mean near-death experiences are not physical. It doesn't mean they violate physical laws. It just means that explaining them might require expanding our understanding of what physical means. It might require new frameworks, new approaches, new categories of explanation, living with mystery frameworks for understanding the incomprehensible. We've journeyed through this mystery from multiple angles: neuroscience, phenomenology, philosophy, psychology, transformation, and we've found ourselves repeatedly encountering the same thing, a profound mystery that resists any single explanation, that exceeds any current framework. So let's ask the question differently. Instead of trying to definitively explain near-death experiences, let's ask, how do we live well with a genuine mystery? How do we hold multiple perspectives without collapsing into confusion? How do we take seriously both the scientific facts and the spiritual dimensions of these experiences? The first thing to understand is that we don't have to choose. We don't have to say either, it's just neurology, or it's a spiritual reality. We can hold both. We can say that near-death experiences involve real neurological processes, that brain activity is involved, that there are measurable correlates. And we can simultaneously say that something profound is happening, that consciousness is encountering something significant, that meaning is being revealed. This is not logically contradictory. A sunset involves real physics. Light of a particular wavelength is reaching your eye. The photons are triggering specific responses in your retina and brain. All of this can be fully explained in physical terms. But that doesn't make the sunset less beautiful. That doesn't make the aesthetic and emotional experience any less genuine. The physics explains the mechanism, but it doesn't explain away the experience. Similarly, near-death experiences involve real neurology. But that doesn't mean they're not also genuine encounters with something profound. That's not logically incoherent. It's not irrational. It's actually a fairly mature way of thinking about phenomena. Understanding the mechanism doesn't require denying the significance of the experience. But there's something deeper here too. What if we've been wrong about the relationship between neurology and spirituality? What if we've been operating under a false assumption that if something is neurological, it can't be spiritual? What if the brain is not the obstacle to spirituality, but the instrument through which spirituality manifests in the material world? Think about it this way. If consciousness is fundamental, if reality is ultimately conscious, if the universe is not unconscious matter, with consciousness somehow mysteriously emerging from it, but rather consciousness goes all the way down and matter is a manifestation of consciousness, then neurology wouldn't be the thing preventing spirituality. Neurology would be how spirituality becomes embodied in physical form. This is a possibility suggested by various contemplative traditions, by quantum physics if we interpret it in particular ways, by theories of consciousness that see consciousness as more fundamental than conventional materialism suggests. From this perspective, the brain is like an antenna. It's not generating consciousness. It's receiving consciousness. It's translating consciousness into neural patterns that can produce behavior and thought and experience. If this is true, then near-death experiences might be moments when the antenna is damaged in particular ways. The normal reception is disrupted, and the person temporarily gets reception of something that's usually filtered out. Or alternately, the antenna is freed from its normal constraints and can receive more directly. This is speculative, but it's worth considering, because it suggests that neurology and spirituality are not enemies but partners. That understanding the brain's role in near-death experiences doesn't exclude the possibility that consciousness is encountering something real. There's also the question of different ways of knowing. Science is one way of knowing. It's a powerful way. It's good for understanding mechanisms, for predicting outcomes, for building technologies. But it's not the only way of knowing. There's experiential knowing. What it's like to experience something. The first-person perspective. This kind of knowing is crucial for understanding consciousness, meaning value. It can't be dismissed as less real than scientific knowing. It's just a different kind of knowing. There's contemplative knowing. The knowing that arises from deep meditation or prayer or other practices. This can reveal aspects of consciousness and reality that scientific study misses. It can be tested through repeated practice and the consistency of insights across practitioners. There's intuitive knowing, the direct apprehension of truth that sometimes bypasses logical reasoning. Carl Jung called this the function of intuition. It's not irrational. It's a different kind of rationality. There's relational knowing, the understanding that comes from genuine connection with others, from seeing things from another perspective, from empathy and compassion. None of these ways of knowing contradicts scientific knowing, but they complement it. They add dimensions of understanding that science alone cannot provide. Near-death experiences might be calling us to integrate these different ways of knowing, to understand reality not just from the outside, through objective measurement, but from the inside, through subjective experience. Not just through mechanisms, but through meaning. There's something else worth considering. The universal human tendency to find meaning in near-death experiences across cultures and centuries suggests something. It suggests that humans everywhere are recognizing something in these experiences that matters. Something that touches something deep in human consciousness. Whether that something is a genuine encounter with spiritual reality or a deep truth about consciousness or an insight into human nature, it matters. It changes how people live. It makes them more compassionate. It makes them less afraid. It makes them more connected. And maybe that's the ultimate answer. Not what is objectively true about near-death experiences, but what they reveal about what matters. What they show us about value, about what makes life worth living. A near-death experience doesn't change whether God exists or whether there's an afterlife or whether consciousness survives death. It might provide evidence in either direction, but it doesn't settle these questions definitively. What it does change is how a person lives. It changes what they care about. It changes how they treat others. It changes how they understand their place in the universe. In a way, the transformation that follows near-death experiences is the most important data point. Not the mechanism of the experience, not the explanation, but the fruit that emerges from it. The fact that people become more compassionate, more at peace, more connected, more loving. If the experience is true, these changes make sense as alignment with reality. We're recognizing our true nature and nature of others. If the experience is not true in a metaphysical sense, these changes still make sense as healing, as the psyche generating exactly what it needs for wholeness. Either way, something real is happening. Something that matters. The boundary as teacher, what death's threshold reveals. We've explored the mystery of near-death experiences from many angles. Let's conclude by asking a different kind of question. Not what is near-death experience, but what is it teaching us? What does this mystery reveal about consciousness, about reality, about what matters? The first thing near-death experiences teach us is that consciousness is stranger and more profound than our normal understanding suggests. Our everyday awareness, the sense of being a separate individual moving through space and time, making choices and living a life, is only one mode of consciousness. It's the mode we're most familiar with, but it's not the only possible mode. Consciousness can be different. It can be boundless rather than localized. It can be timeless rather than temporal. It can be filled with meaning that transcends individual understanding. Near-death experiences show us that consciousness has capacities we don't normally access. This suggests that perhaps in our normal waking state, we're accessing only a fraction of what consciousness actually is. We're using a fraction of what consciousness can be. Like someone with perfect color vision who has spent their whole life in a black and white room. They don't know what they're missing until they step outside. The second thing near-death experiences teach us is about the nature of love and connection. The most consistently reported feature of near-death experiences is the encounter with overwhelming, unconditional love. Not love of anything in particular, not love that depends on being worthy or deserving of it, just love, fundamental, complete, accepting. The fact that this is what people encounter at the boundary of consciousness suggests something about what consciousness fundamentally is. What if consciousness is not fundamentally individual and competitive, as our everyday experience suggests, but fundamentally connected and loving? What if the separation we experience, the sense that we're isolated individuals in a world of other isolated individuals, is a kind of useful illusion? A feature of consciousness focused on the individual perspective. But when consciousness shifts, when the veil of individual identification drops, what remains is connection. What remains is love. This is consistent with various spiritual traditions that propose that at the deepest level of reality, there is unity. That the sense of separation is an illusion of the surface. That beneath the appearance of multiplicity is fundamental oneness. That love is the recognition of this fundamental unity. The third thing near-death experiences teach us is about the limitations of our current frameworks for understanding reality. None of our current models, whether scientific or religious, fully explains near-death experiences. This should humble us. It should make us willing to question our certainties. It should make us open to the possibility that reality might be deeper and stranger than we've imagined. Science has given us tremendous knowledge and tremendous power. But science, when it becomes scientism, can become a kind of dogmatism, a belief that only what can be measured and tested is real, that only what fits into our current physical models is true. But consciousness itself doesn't fit neatly into the current physical model. And consciousness is the foundation of everything we know. We know the external world through consciousness. We know matter through consciousness. We know any laws of physics through consciousness observing physical phenomena. So it's strange to have a model of reality that excludes consciousness or reduces consciousness to merely a byproduct of physical processes. That's like a model of art that excludes the artist, like a model of thought that excludes thinking. Near-death experiences are challenging us to expand our models, to make room for consciousness as something more fundamental, to integrate subjective and objective understanding, to develop a science of consciousness that honors what consciousness actually is, rather than trying to squeeze it into categories that don't fit. The fourth thing near-death experiences teach us is about the importance of meaning. One of the most striking things about near-death experiences is the sense of meaning that they carry, not abstract intellectual meaning, but lived meaning, felt meaning, the sense that existence is deeply meaningful, that there's purpose, that love is real, that connection is real. In our modern world, many people feel a kind of meaninglessness. We live in a kind of existential void. We're told that the universe is fundamentally meaningless, that we're accidental byproducts of blind physical processes. That meaning is something we create subjectively, not something we discover objectively. And from this perspective, the pursuit of meaning can feel futile. If the universe is meaningless, how can our meaning-making matter? If it's all subjective projection, isn't it all empty? But near-death experiences suggest something different. They suggest that meaning is real, that it's discovered, not merely created. That consciousness, when it touches something deep, encounters something genuinely meaningful. What if meaning is not subjective illusion, but fundamental feature of reality? What if the universe is not meaningless but full of meaning? What if consciousness is inherently purposeful? What if love and connection and growth and learning are not illusions but real aspects of what existence actually is? From this perspective, near-death experiences are moments when consciousness stops filtering and encounters reality directly, when it stops being mediated by individual concerns and touches something universal. And what it touches is profoundly meaningful. The fifth, and perhaps most important thing near-death experiences teach us is about how to live. Because regardless of what's ultimately true about these experiences, they teach us something crucial about how to live. They teach us that the things that matter are connection, love, compassion, meaning growth. They teach us that fear of death is not necessary, that we can live more fully if we're not driven by mortality anxiety, that we can be more present if we're not constantly worried about our own survival. They teach us that what we value matters, that the decisions we make about how to spend our energy and attention shape who we become, that compassion and service and love are not weaknesses, but the highest expressions of strength and purpose. They teach us that we're connected to each other and to all of existence in ways we normally forget. That harming others is harming ourselves. That serving others is serving ourselves. That we're not isolated individuals but part of a larger whole. These are truths that most wisdom traditions have pointed to. that most contemplative practices reveal, that most genuine spirituality emphasizes, and near-death experiences are giving ordinary people access to these truths. They're not convincing people intellectually, they're showing people directly. And that's why the transformation is so lasting. And so we've journeyed together through this deep mystery. We've explored the medical paradoxes and the phenomenology of near-death. We've looked at how cultures across the world describe similar experiences. We've examined what neuroscience can tell us and where it reaches its limits. We've grappled with the hard problem of consciousness and the puzzle of heightened cognition in the dying state. We've looked at how these experiences transform people's lives and thought about what that transformation might mean. We've acknowledged the gap between mechanism and meaning, between mechanism and mystery. And we've asked what these experiences teach us about consciousness, about meaning, about how to live. The honest truth is that we still don't know definitively what near-death experiences are. We don't have a complete explanation. We have pieces of understanding. We have scientific facts about brain states. We have philosophical frameworks. We have phenomenological descriptions. We have reports of transformation. But we don't have a complete picture that ties everything together and explains everything away. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the ultimate answer to the question, what happens when your brain stops, is not a definitive scientific explanation. Perhaps the answer is that consciousness touches something profound, something that we can't fully comprehend from our ordinary perspective, something that changes us. We know that people emerge from near-death experiences transformed. We know that they become less afraid, more compassionate, more connected to meaning. We know that they feel they've encountered something utterly real and significant. Whether we call that something God, or universal consciousness, or the fabric of reality itself, or a profound deep truth about what consciousness actually is, might matter less than the fact that they've been changed by it. And that change, that transformation, that deepening of compassion and connection and meaning and peace, that is something real. That is something worth understanding. That is something worth honoring. The question of what happens when the brain stops has led us not to a simple answer, but to a deeper mystery. And sometimes the deepest truths cannot be captured in simple answers. Sometimes they can only be lived, embodied, expressed through how we treat each other, through how much love we can allow ourselves to feel and express, through how present we can be to the profound mystery of existence. Thank you for spending these hours with me in this exploration. I hope it's given you something to sit with, something to reflect on, something to carry forward into your life. Sleep well.